Alright, so let's talk about filing status. So they have 5 different filing statuses, and first, married filing jointly. Second is married filing separately, something called a qualified widow or widower, also called a surviving spouse, single, or head of household. So you're only one of those. Married filing jointly is long as you're married on the last day of the year, you can file married filing jointly with your spouse. If you don't elect to do that, then you have to file married filing separately, which, as you can see from just if you look at the tax levels, tax rates for each, it's more advantageous to file married filing jointly than it is married filing separately. There's absolutely no good reason to file married filing separately. For tax reasons, now probably the only reason you would want to file separately is if there's something going on, like you married someone who had previous tax problems and you just don't want to be involved with their tax issues. Either you don't want, you're getting a refund and you don't want that refund levied. In other words, if you filed with your spouse on a joint return and you got a refund, they would just take that refund and apply it to any old debt that your spouse owes on taxes. Whereas if you file separately, you would be able to claim that refund. So, unless you have a situation like that, it's best just to file jointly. The bad thing about married filing jointly is when you file, you have what's called joint and several tax liability. And so, even though you didn't earn the income, if taxes are owed on it, you owe on it if you file jointly. So that's the downside of of married filing jointly. Now, if one spouse dies during the year, you're considered a surviving spouse or a qualifying widow or widower, which we'll talk about here in a second. Again, there's really no good reason to file separately, but if you're married at the end of the year, that's your choice if you elect not to file jointly. All right, so qualifying widow or widower, if you are that, your spouse dies during a particular year, this qualifies you as a qualifying widow or widower for the year of death and 2 years following the year of the spouse's death, as long as you do not remarry during that 2-year period. And so you have to have a dependent child living in the surviving spouse's home, and the surviving spouse must maintain that household for the dependent child. As far as the maintaining, they must pay over half of the cost of maintaining the household where the dependent child lives, and that dependent child must live in that household for the entire year. So what's the advantage of being a surviving spouse? Well, if you look at the tax rates, it's the same. You get the same standard deduction as married filing jointly. So it helps from that standpoint. Again, if you look back at, let's see where that is. Yeah, if you look back at Exhibit 4-7 on page 9, the qualifying widow or widower gets the standard deduction, the same standard deduction as married filing jointly. That's the advantage of being a qualified widow or widower. Otherwise, your choices are single, well, not single, but head of household, or maybe single. But if you've got a qualifying child, you're probably just going to be qualifying as head of household, which doesn't have as high of a standard deduction, only $9,300 if you're head of household, or $9,350 for 2017. Single, very simply, if you're single at the end of a tax year, you are single and you file as single. Head of household. As far as standard deductions are concerned, it's somewhere between married filing jointly and single or married filing separately. So it provides some relief, but not as much as if you're a qualifying widow or widower or married filing jointly. And so you have to meet certain requirements in order to be head of qualify as a head of household. You have to be either unmarried or considered unmarried at the end of the year, and that considered unmarried deals with what's called abandoned spouses that we'll talk about. You must not be a qualifying widow or widower, surviving spouse. You must pay more than half the cost of keeping up a home during the year, and in that home lived a taxpayer's qualifying person for more than half of the year. Now, the exception here, if you're trying to get head of household, is if the qualifying person is one of your parents or both of your parents. They don't have to live with you more than half the year. They actually don't have to live with you at all. Now, what happens if you're married? You have a child living with you that is a qualifying child. They live with you for more than half the year, and you pay 1/2 the cost of maintaining a household that serves as the principal abode for that qualifying child for more than half the year. If you're married but you don't live with the spouse, you're considered an abandoned spouse if they haven't lived with you for the last 6 months of the tax year in question. So you have to live apart from them the last 6 months, at least. What does that get you? Well, and let me say here, of course, the problem here is you're married to someone, you're separated, you may not even know where they are, but let's say you do know where they are. You probably don't want to file a tax return with them because they're probably not going to cooperate with you. So, I mean, that's usually the problem here. So, as long as you don't file a joint return with the other spouse, but you're married to them at the end of the year, and you meet these other requirements of maintaining the household, and you've got a qualifying child that lives for more than half a year, and as long as that spouse does not live with you for the last 6 months of the year, you get head of household treatment, which is better than uh, what you would otherwise be able to file as, which would be married filing separately. That would be really bad. So this provides medium relief. It's not as good as married filing jointly, but it's at least some relief for the taxpayer. Well, what's a qualifying person under this um, abandoned spouse classification? Well, it's either a qualifying child or a qualifying relative who is the taxpayer's mother or father. Note here again, the parent need not live with the taxpayer. Again, the taxpayer must pay 1/2 the cost of maintaining the separate household for the taxpayer's mother or father if that is the qualifying relative. And the parent must qualify as the taxpayer's dependent, which means they must meet the gross income test as well as the support test, which is actually that second requirement. Taxpayer must pay greater than 1/2 the cost of maintaining the separate household. So it's really about whether or not the parent makes more than $4,050. What if the qualifying relative is not the taxpayer's parent? Well, that person must have lived with the taxpayer for more than half the year, must qualify as the taxpayer's dependent, and must be related to the taxpayer through the qualified family relationship. Note here, if related only because they lived with the taxpayer for the entire year, they are not considered a qualified person. All right, so here we have an example. Assuming that last year Rodney passed away, that's the husband, and during the current year Anita did not remarry but maintained a household for Braxton and Tara, her dependent children. Under these circumstances, what would Anita's filing status be? Surviving spouse, or qualifying widow, if you will. Assume Rodney and Anita divorced last year. During the current year, Braxton lives with Anita, and Anita pays all the costs of maintaining the household for herself and Braxton. Under these circumstances, what is Anita's filing status for the current year? Head of household? Number 3, assume Sean, Rodney's brother, lived with the Halls, but Sean paid more than half the cost of maintaining a separate apartment that is the principal residence of his mother Sharon, whose gross income is $1,500. Because Sean provided more than half of Sharon's support during the year, and because Sharon's gross income was only $1,500, she qualifies as Sean's dependent because she's a qualifying relative. In these circumstances, what is Sean's filing status? Head of household? Because he paid more than half the cost of maintaining a separate household that is the principal place of abode of his mother, and his mother qualifies as his dependent. The end. Next time, chapter 5. We'll dive deeper into gross income and exclusions.